Hello, everybody, and welcome to a video where I'm going to be teaching you how to evaluate cards for Magic the Gathering with a specific eye towards Limited. With Neon Dynasty preview season in full swing, there are tons of new cards being revealed every day, and you're going to want to know how to evaluate those cards so you can know when you're supposed to be drafting them and how good they're going to be. If you do enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. And without further ado, let's get started on this educational journey. So the first thing to talk about are some basic principles for card evaluation, the first of which is be open to new ideas. Every set is different, every format is going to play out a bit differently, and so you need to be able to approach the cards in that format with a fresh perspective, a fresh set of eyes, and don't come in with too many judgments. It's okay to learn from the past, but it's also very important not to get caught up in the things that were good in the previous format. For example, oftentimes when a color is really bad in a set, the set afterwards, it'll be underdrafted at first because people just assume that color is bad in general when it was really just about that particular environment. The same goes for colors that are very good and things of that nature. So it's important to be open to new ideas, open to new card types that might potentially outperform what they did in the past, and make sure you are willing to see things from almost like the eyes of a novice or someone who hasn't played before, because every set is something nobody's ever really played before. Next up is power level is relative. Every set is going to have a different power level, and so some cards that are good in the past might be very good now, or they might be less good because of the cards around them. There are synergies that may exist in a particular set that don't exist in others, so cards can vary in power level between sets, and then there are some sets that are just straight up more powerful. The cards are better in general, and when every card is better, that means that there's a higher bar to be exceptional in the set. And when all the cards in the set are worse, there's a lower bar to be exceptional because power level is relative, and so it's important to be able to recognize that some cards are going to be fitting into a specific set that is going to be higher power level. So for example, oftentimes like a set like Modern Horizons or a Masters set is going to be very high power level because it features reprints that are going to be maybe good for Modern. And so those are really high power level, high synergy sets. And something like a core set is oftentimes going to be lower on the power level scale with more simplistic mechanics and things like that. And then most other sets fall in between somewhere in that spectrum. And then finally, always have a reason for your grade. If you are going to be evaluating cards, you're not always going to get them right, but as long as you have some sort of justification or logic behind your evaluation, you're going to be on the right path, because then if the card doesn't perform as well as you thought it would, you have something to compare it to. Instead of just saying, oh, this card looks good to me, you say, this card looks good to me because I think it's going to be very good when I'm curving out in my aggressive decks. And then maybe you play an aggressive deck, you play that card in it, and it doesn't actually perform very well, and you have a baseline to compare your grade to. You say, well, I had an aggressive deck and this card didn't perform well. Was that just variance, or was it just not really well suited to that type of deck? And because you had a reason for your grade, you're able to then move forward and determine what you need to shift with your evaluation of the card, and that's very important. So having a reason for your grade is one of the key basic principles. Now we're going to moving on to the 3 C's of card evaluation. So this will help you remember how you can evaluate cards. The first method is comparison, comparing one card to a card from a previous format that you've seen before. Oftentimes they print similar effects in sets, and so you can use that knowledge of how the card has performed in the past to see how it's going to perform in the current set. The next method is the cookie cutter method, which is a step-by-step way to evaluate the card if it's a bit of a newer card or a set-specific mechanic is maybe in play or things of that nature where you can't really directly compare it to a previous card, but there are some tools that you have in your arsenal to use to evaluate the card. And then finally, context. You can take what you know about the specific set to apply it to a card and see if that is going to shift your evaluation of it, whether or not that card is going to perform very well in the set because of the mechanics around it, or the synergy pieces around it, or what that specific color combo is trying to do, or things of that nature. And we're going to go into each of those in more depth now and use some examples from Neon Dynasty to demonstrate how you can apply these methods. So first off, with comparison, here are the steps to follow. First of all, you find a similar card from a previous set, which if you're going to be using the comparison method, this is really what shouldn't be that difficult because usually the card just pops to mind immediately. Second, evaluate the power level of the old card. Was it a very good card? Was it a very bad card? Was it somewhere in between? Was it a rock solid card, a top common, mediocre chaff? Those sorts of things should then be like evaluate basically the old card because you have all of this experience with it or context, or you just know how good the old card was. And then finally, you analyze the differences between the two cards. And then from that point on, you can then identify, okay, is this card going to perform slightly better, slightly worse, significantly better, generally things of that nature. So let's get to an example. In the new set, there is a card, Tamiyo's Completion. So in Neon Dynasty, Tamiyo's Completion is 3 in a blue. It has flash, it enchants an artifact, creature, or planeswalker, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap the enchanted permanent. If it's an equipment, unattach it, and then the enchanted permanent loses all abilities and doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. Now, when I saw this card, the first card I thought of was Capture Sphere, a card that has been printed several times in the past. It has a lot of the same things going on. It has flash, it enchants a creature, and it taps the creature. And the enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. So using the comparison method, we can say, well, Capture Sphere was solid but not exceptional in the formats that it was in. Tamiyo's Completion is going to be at a baseline, probably solid but not exceptional, or maybe like Capture Sphere has varied from solid to like kind of mediocre. So it's probably in that range. Tamiyo's Completion does have some additional upside in the fact that it can enchant artifacts or planeswalkers, and also the fact that the enchanted permanent loses all of its abilities, and that it also can like be used on equipments and things like that. So Tamiyo's Completion has slight upside, but because it like casting cost and general effect, it does the same thing as Capture Sphere, using a comparison method here is very apt. And so I have kind of a baseline to evaluate Tamiyo's Completion from, where it's like, well, in the past, this sort of effect has been medium, and so Tamiyo's Completion is probably going to be medium and maybe slightly better than medium, depending on if the extra upside actually ends up doing a ton. Next up example of the comparison method is Spirited Companion. It is 1 and a white for a 1/1 that is an enchantment creature, and when a Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And this card immediately brings to mind the card Elvish Visionary, which is a classic for Magic the Gathering. It was seen in Magic Origins and a lot of sets before that as well, which is 1 and a green for a 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So immediately, a lot of comparisons. It's important to sometimes look for comparisons across the color pie, which is why this is a particularly good example, because you don't only have to compare it to cards that perform specifically within other white decks. I mean, Elvish Visionary is a green card, and you can compare it across colors if the effects are similar like this, and it's nice to see. So first of all, similar stats. Elvish Visionary in its format was solid, but not like taking over the game. It wasn't like an all-star or anything like that. And Spirited Companion, kind of from a baseline, has the same thing. Now, the differences are important. In Magic Origins, elves was kind of a tribe that you could actually do stuff with, and so Elvish Visionary benefited from being an elf. Spirited Companion, on the other hand, is an enchantment creature, and in this set, there are some enchantment synergies, and so Spirited Companion can benefit from enchantment synergies or fuel your enchantment synergies. Similarly, there is also a potential equipment theme in the Neon Dynasty set. There is an equipment theme because of the reconfigure mechanic and things of that nature, and so Spirited Companion can benefit from those equipment synergies because equipments really like having small creatures to put them on, because that really boosts that creature up in power level. So Spirited Companion is probably going to be slightly better than Elvish Visionary was, because not only is the enchantment creature part relevant, but also this equipment synergies and things like that can also be relevant. And so starting from a solid baseline, and then maybe even slightly better because of the synergies available in the format. So that's another example of the comparison method. The next method we're going to be talking about is the cookie cutter method. It's really good for more complex cards that are less simple or maybe use set-specific mechanics or things like that. So here are the steps for the cookie cutter method. The first thing you're going to do is apply the vanilla test. The vanilla test is a method for evaluating cards where you kind of remove the text box and see how the card would be if you just had the mana cost and the stats. And so if it's, say, a 3-mana 2/2 with abilities, you say, well, how good would a 3-mana 2/2 be? And the answer to that is not particularly great. Or you could say, how good would if it was a 3-mana 3/3 with abilities? And you say, how good would a 3-mana 3/3 with no text be? And a 3-mana 3/3 is actually solid a lot of the time. And so you can then view the ability as extra gravy instead of just being like, well, the ability is not particularly good, so the card isn't particularly good. The vanilla test is a good way of separating the abilities of the card from the actual stat line you're getting for the mana you're paying. Next up is evaluating the floor and ceiling of the card. This is a great way to see if the card is really high upside pick, if it's a card that you kind of need to do some work to make it really good, or if it's just going to always be rock solid and never really perform like exceptionally well. And that's just really important to know, because if a card is going to perform poorly a lot of the time, it's oftentimes not going to be a very good card, because maybe that specific situation it's good in isn't going to come up very often. And then finally, use the quadrant theory. The quadrant theory is evaluating the card when you're ahead, when you're behind, when you're in the developing stages of the game, and when you're at parity in the game. And so that's a really like fundamentally great way to look at the nature of a card, because if a card is good in an early game deck, or only good when you're ahead, or things of that nature, you're not going to want to put that into every sort of environment, and so it kind of takes away from the flexibility of the card. We're going to look at some examples here, starting off with Twin Shot Sniper. This is a pretty unique design. It's 3 and a red for a 2/3 with reach. It's an artifact creature, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target, but it also has the set-specific mechanic Channel. It's a mechanic that is returning, but it hasn't returned for such a long time that it's not really a mechanic we've seen recently. But it has channel, which is 1 and a red, discard it, and it deals 2 damage to any target. And so let's just evaluate it through the lenses we just talked about. The vanilla test, 4 mana for a 2/3 is not a particularly good stat line. And so that means that the ability does have to be relevant, or the text box has to be relevant for this card to actually have some merits in the environment. 2, the floor and the ceiling. The floor is a 4 mana 2/3 that deals 2 to the opponent, which is not exceptional. 2/3 reach that deals damage to the opponent, but the ceiling is a 4 mana 2/3 that kills your opponent's creature. Also noting with the vanilla test, the fact that the channel ability, that should also be evaluated with the vanilla test. 2 mana to deal 2 to any target is also not particularly great on the vanilla test. But yeah, the flexibility here is really what makes it a good card. The floor is a 4 mana deal 2 to the opponent, 2/3, or a deal 2 to the opponent at channel speed. The ceiling is a 2-for-1 because you play your 4 mana 2/3, you kill your opponent's creature, and it really does a lot of work there. And then Quadrant Theory, let's just evaluate this card. In the early turns, it's a great card because you need to do 2 mana deal 2 in that situation a lot of the time. In the mid game, when the game is at parity, it's a pretty good card because you can oftentimes kill one of your opponent's creatures, or you can deal damage to like finish off a larger creature or things of that nature. If you're ahead, it's a good card because it can finish off your opponent with direct damage. It can also get rid of your opponent's blockers. And when you're behind, this card is actually great as well because it can deal with one of your opponent's attackers and also provide a blocker, and it can stop flyers. And so with those lenses, you can see that because of, even though the vanilla test didn't really do a lot, the floor and ceiling evaluation and the Quadrant Theory was really effective for evaluating the twin shot sniper. And so this card actually looks very, very good to me because looking at how it plays out in different stages of the game is really important. Another card that we can look at a little bit simpler is Greater Tanuki, 4 green for a 6/5 trample, and then it has the channel ability, 2 and a green, discard Greater Tanuki, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And so this is kind of similar to cards we've seen in the past, but because of the channel ability, it's kind of got significant differences from previous like big green creatures, and so I figured it would be better to use a cookie cutter approach versus a comparison approach. So looking at the first thing, the vanilla test, 6 mana for a 6/5. Oftentimes when you're using the vanilla test, you can factor in basic keywords. So in the previous example, factoring in reach is something you can do. So like a 4 mana 2/3 reach, or this one's a 6 mana 6/5 trample. And that's reasonable stat line. 6 mana 6/6 trample has been playable in the past, and this one is only slightly worse than that. It's also an enchantment creature, which can be relevant potentially. And so that's the vanilla test. 6 mana 6/5, already kind of a solid card. Like it's a card that you're fine playing some percentage of the time. And then you look at the floor and the ceiling of the card. The floor of this card is relatively high. And what I mean by that is it's never going to really be a terrible card, but the ceiling is also never exceptional. So in the previous example, the ceiling was quite high because getting a 2-for-1 on your card is really, really good. But on this one, you're never really getting a 2-for-1. You're just getting either one solid effect or a different solid effect. But that means the floor is very high. The fact that the channel ability means that you can discard the Greater Tanuki to get a basic land card means that you're going to be able to use this in the early stages of the game or the late stages of the game. If you don't have, if you need something to spend your mana on, or if you don't have the mana to spend on it, you can then just get an extra land from your deck. So the floor is very high on this card, and the ceiling is not particularly like it's the floor and the ceiling are basically the same. It does very similar things, but the fact that the floor is very high is important. And finally, Quadrant Theory. In the early turns of the game, it's pretty nice because you can ramp yourself. In the middle stages of the game, at board parity, it's pretty good because it can go over the top. If you're ahead, it can do good stuff because it will help you trample over those final points of damage and just be a big threat. And if you're behind, it doesn't do a ton because if they like bounce it, you just get really wrecked. So it's not as good when you're behind, but it's still solid because if you do land it, it can oftentimes stabilize you. So this is the sort of card that actually performs pretty well under Quadrant Theory, pretty well under the floor ceiling test, and it ends up looking like a very solid card because the flexibility that it gives you and also the power level it gives you seems pretty good, especially for a common, and looks like a pretty good card as a result. And so using that analysis can be a good way to look at the card. The final method of evaluation we're going to be looking at is the context method. So here are the steps for the context method. First, you basically ask yourself a series of questions. How does the card line up with the format? Is the card going to be, does the card have like 1 toughness when the format really punishes 1 toughness? Does it have 3 toughness when all of the burn spells deal 2 damage and so it really lines up well? Is it a death touch creature in a format with a ton of big creatures to kill with death touch? Those are the sorts of things to ask about a card. Next, is there synergy with other cards in its color? Is it like a key cog in what blue is trying to do in that format? Or is it a burn spell that like synergizes with your prowess creatures or things of that nature, or cards that care about you casting like spells, things of that nature? Is it their synergy within its color? Then is there synergy with cards in other colors? Is it particularly good in a specific 2-color combination? Is it a secret gold card that's really only good in one particular archetype but is very good there? Those are important things to analyze as well. And then finally, is it the key for an archetype? That also kind of ties into the secret gold card, but it can also just be, this is the card that makes the archetype tick. This is the card that is kind of like running the show. You kind of build the deck with this card in mind, and it's really a key card because of a unique effect that it has on the game. So let's look at some examples to kind of evaluate this method. So we're going to start by looking at Michiko's Reign of Truth. This is target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact and enchantment you control, and then it does that twice, and then you can exile the saga and return to the battlefield transformed under your control, and it will transform into, as I will show you here, it transforms into Portrait of Michiko, which is gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control. So let's look at how this card works. How does the card line up with the format? Now, because the format hasn't actually come out yet, it's hard to say how this is going to line up, but some things you can look for is if there's a lot of creatures that are going to have like Death Touch or things like that, this card wouldn't line up particularly well, because a Death Touch card would trade with the creature no matter how the card lined up with the form, no matter how much +1/+1 you gave your creature or things of that nature. If there's a lot of removal spells that are going to target your creature in response to you targeting with your Reign of Truth, that's also not going to work out particularly well. If there's a ton of like enchantment removal or things that are going to punish your enchantments, then that card wouldn't line up well. However, on the other hand, if white is an aggressive color that cares about buffs and has a lot of enchantment creatures running around, this card could line up extremely well with the format. So those are the sorts of things to keep in mind for that one. Next, is there synergy in the color? Does white care about enchantments? Does white care about attacking? Because this is a fundamentally aggressive ability. Those are two of the key things you're going to want to ask yourself about this card. 3, is there synergy outside the color? Is there a particular color combination that cares particularly much about accumulating artifacts and enchantments? Is there a particular color combination that's really aggressive that wants this sort of buff effect? Are there cards that care about having their power buffed so that you can attack with one big creature instead of a bunch of little creatures? That's another thing to keep in mind. And then finally, is it an archetype key? Is this the sort of card where you take it early and then build your deck to really maximize Michiko's Reign of Truth? Or is it the sort of card that you just kind of slot into any white deck and it'll perform well? And again, Portrait of Michiko is the card it flips into, which is a 0/0 that has that same text. So it's +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control. So if you have like basically doing this, if you have like 3 artifacts or enchantments in play reliably, it's a 2-mana 3/3 that also gave +3/+3 to different creatures over the course of the game, which can be very devastating indeed. It's going to depend a little bit more on how the format specifically plays out, and once we see all of the cards in the set, it's really going to be much easier to determine, but these are the sorts of questions to ask yourself about this sort of card. Next up, we're looking at Simian Sling, which is a red mana for an artifact creature, Equipment Monkey. It has the reconfigure mechanic, so you can attach it to target creature or unattach it from a creature, and you reconfigure as a sorcery, and it gives the equipped creature +1/+1, and when the equipped creature becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to defending player. So let's look at the first question. How does the card line up with the format? Is a 1/1 a relevant stat line? Are there a lot of X1s running around so this can actually have a chance of trading with a creature? Are artifacts incredibly important to have? Is +1/+1 a particularly relevant stat boost in the format? Like, are there a lot of symmetrical creatures? Like, if the creatures are oftentimes like 3/2s, then giving +1/+1 doesn't do a ton, because trading a 3, you're still trading your 3/2 for your 3/2. Whereas if all of the cards are like 2/2s and 3/3s, then all of a sudden giving +1/+1 is more effective, because a 2/2 turning into a 3/3 all of a sudden trades up on mana instead of trading for the same equal cost or things of that nature. Next, is there synergy in color? Does red really care about having artifacts? We already have seen the 2/3 reach creature from earlier that was also an artifact creature. Maybe artifacts are just incredibly important for red, and so you just want any artifacts you can, and this is a perfect synergy piece to get you the ball rolling on turn 1. Is like the fact that it gives +1/+1 really important for red? There is a mechanic in this format, Modified, that cares about having your creatures equipped, and maybe that's incredibly important for red, and that can potentially be really important for context within the format. Is there synergy outside of the color? Is there one color combination in particular, potentially blue-red or things like that really care about artifacts? Is there a color combination that really cares about equipping your creatures? this is also relevant information because potentially it could have a really good home in one particular archetype. And then finally, is it an archetype key? Is this the sort of card where you have 4 Simian Slings and you're like super pumped? Or maybe is it just the card that you play one copy of because it's going to be really nice to have access to one, but you never really want to have multiples? It's going to be a little bit dependent on the other cards we see in the format and the sort of payoffs for reconfigure, but this is the sort of question to ask. It doesn't look like this would be the sort of archetype key as the previous saga we looked at would be, because the saga before has like a really high upside if you build your deck around it, whereas this is kind of like lower power level, but could potentially be a great synergy piece for a particular deck. Finally, we're going to be talking about the biggest trap to fall into. You have to be realistic when you are evaluating cards. That doesn't mean that you're just like always looking at the worst case scenario, but it's important to avoid best case scenario mentality, which is the big pitfall of card evaluators everywhere. And best case scenario mentality is where you only view the card in the best possible lens for that card. So for example, you imagine that every time you are looking at a 2-drop card and you imagine yourself always casting it on turn 2, instead of remembering the fact that you're sometimes going to draw that 2-drop in the late game and it's not going to do a ton. Your 1-drop equipment monkey, you're going to draw that in the late game sometimes. How does it perform in your deck when that happens? Things like that of that nature. Now, it is important to remember that you are going to be building your deck to try and enable the best case scenario, but sometimes you're not going to get there, and so it's important to also recognize the downsides. With that saga we looked at earlier that gives +1/+1 for each artifact and enchantment you control, there are going to be some percentage of games where it just gives +1/+1, and that is a downside that is important to recognize with the card. While it's easy to say, oh my gosh, this card's going to be giving +3/+3, +4/+4, even bigger, it's going to be a massive impact on the game, it can also kind of have downside, and so that's important to be realistic and have best case scenario mentality, kind of not really to not have best case scenario mentality, to kind of avoid that pitfall, and just double check yourself at the end of your process for evaluating cards to just be like, okay, am I being realistic with this evaluation? And that's a pretty good way to punch through that best case scenario mentality. Now, altogether, we're going to be looking at the combination of these evaluation methods of the 3 C's, and it's really nice because combining tools can be a great way to evaluate the tricky cards. The first thing you can do is look for a comparison if there is a comparison. The next thing is to use cookie cutter methods if there isn't a comparison. You generally are going to use comparison or cookie cutter methods because if there is a comparison, the cookie cutter method is kind of already done for you because you've seen how a similar card has performed in the past. Then you want to zoom out and see the context. Looking at the context is important oftentimes with comparison and cookie cutter methods. And it's really important. It's usually the best way is to always apply context to your evaluations. And then finally, double check to make sure you are being realistic. So let's look at some examples of cards where we use 2 methods in one evaluation. So first up, we're going to look at Hot Shot Mechanic using comparison and context. So this is 1-drop mana for a 2/1 artifact creature. So again, an artifact creature that could be relevant. And it has Hotshot Mechanic cruise vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, so it can cruise like a 4-drop. So the comparison that I chose was Usher of the Fallen, which is another 1-mana 2/1 that had a set specific mechanic, Boast in this case, or whereas the Hotshot Mechanic cares about crewing vehicles, which are also in the format. And Usher of the Fallen ended up being a pretty solid card because you weren't actually using the Boast all that often, just as I anticipate Hotshot Mechanic potentially not using its ability all that often, depending on how many vehicles there are in the format, or the extra 2 power not being relevant, depending on how many crew 4 vehicles you're playing. But a 1-mana 2/1 still performed well in that format, and so Hotshot Mechanic already has a baseline of being a solid card in your aggressive decks. Now, let's look at the context. How does the card line up? We're going to have to see more vehicles. There haven't been a ton of vehicles previewed at the common and uncommon level, or even rares for that matter. But we're going to have to see how the card lines up with the format. If there's a lot of vehicles that have high crew values, and there is a deck that really cares about crewing creatures, then Hotshot Mechanic could fit right into that deck. Though it's important to remember that just from the comparison, we already know that it's going to be a solid card. So if you just get rid of the text about crewing vehicles, a 1-mana 2/1 can be very good as an aggressive threat. So we already have that baseline from our comparison, and now we're just looking to see how much better it's going to be because of that extra text on the card. How important is being an artifact creature? Maybe being an artifact creature is really relevant in the format. That's something we're going to have to wait and see a little bit more. Is there synergy in color? Is white just the color that's all about crewing vehicles? If so, or all about artifacts? If so, this card really goes up in value. Is there synergy outside the color? Maybe there's one specific color combination that really cares about crewing vehicles, and Hotshot Mechanic is the perfect card in that deck, and otherwise just a solid card. And then finally, is it an archetype key? Is there a deck that just has a ton of crew 4 vehicles that really wants the Hotshot Mechanic? We're going to have to wait and see more of those cards, but this is the type of question we're going to ask. It seems doubtful to me that there's going to be a deck built around having crew 4 vehicles because that's hard to do, and Hotshot Mechanic is probably going to just be mostly a 1-mana 2/1 that has some random upside, potentially in only one specific color combination. But by using that context and by looking at answering these questions, we can kind of get a better idea of it. The next card we're going to look at with comparison and context, again with that approach, is Lethal Exploit. It's 1 in a black. A target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. It gets an additional -1/-1 until end of turn for each modified creature you controlled as you cast this spell. It's at instant speed. And equipment, auras you control, and counters are modifications. So if you have creatures that are equipped and things like that, that's going to count as modifications. So the initial comparison I wanted to make with this one was to Olivia's Midnight Ambush from Midnight Hunt, which again had a baseline of giving a creature -2/-2, but then also had an additional upside of giving -13/-13. And it's actually worth noting that I think Lethal Exploit is slightly worse than Olivia's Midnight Ambush. Now, a lot of the comparisons we've been looking at have been slightly better than previous cards in the past, but you can also do it with cards that are slightly worse. And Lethal Exploit is not going to be ever giving -13/-13, because at that point you're going to have like 10 creatures in play and just have one by attacking them. But it is a baseline of -2/-2 and then has potential upside for more. And we know from seeing Olivia's Midnight Ambush that the -2/-2 part of the card was not particularly impressive. That part of the card was okay. It was like filler-ish. If you didn't really ever flip it to nighttime, the card was not really good in your deck. And so Lethal Exploit, we now have this baseline of, if we don't have ways to modify our creatures, the card's not going to be particularly great. And so that's a great way to kind of analyze that initial thing. So we're going to have to make sure, if we're looking at format context specifically next, how the modified is going to work with this card. So first, how does the card line up? Now, it is important to remember that every format's different, so sometimes -2/-2 might be better in some formats than others. If there's a lot of 2 toughness creatures, if, for example, every 4-drop is like a 4-mana 4/2, then this card would be great because it would kill a lot of the 4-drops. Now, that's not going to happen. It's just not how they make sets. But it's important to remember that different amounts of damage are sometimes different breakpoints within a format. So -2/-2 can line up differently depending on the format, and so we'll have to see how that ends up being for Lethal Exploit after we can see all of the cards, how many of them have 2 toughness and things of that nature. Next, is there synergy in the color? Is there a lot of ways to modify your creatures within your black deck? Or is it synergy outside of the color? Is this the perfect card for a like red-black modified deck, or is there like a specific color combination, maybe black-green or whatever, that puts a lot of counters on creatures that like really uses Lethal Exploit well there? If there's a lot of synergy outside of the color, like if every other color in the set really modifies creatures heavily, then this card could be great, because if you have a couple of modified creatures, it could be like 2 mana -3/-3, which is actually quite nice. And so if there's a lot of synergy outside the color, even if there isn't a ton of synergy in the color, this card can still perform well. And then finally, is it an archetype key? Now that is unlikely, because this is a removal effect. It's not really the type of effect that you're going to build your whole deck around. It's not like, wow, I'm building the Lethal Exploit deck. It's more likely going to be just a good card in specific decks, or a like mediocre card in other decks. But it's also always worth asking, is this going to be like the key piece of my archetype? Now that we've seen a couple of comparison and context examples, let's look at cookie cutter and context examples next. So Covert Technician is a great example for this. It is 2 in a blue for a 2/4. It has Ninjutsu, which is an ability when you can return an unblocked attacker you control to your hand and put this onto the battlefield from your hand to tapped and attacking. And then whenever Covert Technician deals combat damage to a player, you can put an artifact card with mana value less than or equal to that damage from your hand onto the battlefield. So let's start off with our cookie cutter method, because this is a pretty unique effect. First of all, the vanilla test. 3 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature. How good would that card be? It's also a human ninja. Not particularly great. 3 mana 2/4 is generally not a stat line that you're thrilled to play. It's not terrible, but it's also not great. So it's going to need a little bit of extra juice. Next, floor and ceiling. The floor is a 3 mana 2/4. The ceiling is a 2 mana ninjutsu that you then get to put a 2-drop artifact into play. So the ceiling and the floor are actually really far apart in this case. Whereas before we were looking at floors and ceilings that in some cases were very close together. This one has a very different effect depending on when you use it. If you go 1-drop, if you cast like a 1-drop creature and then attack with it and ninjutsu in the Covert Technician, you can then potentially put an artifact creature into play and be getting a huge amount of value. And as we have seen, there are several artifact creatures that we've already looked at. There's the 1-drop in white, the Fox Pilot, that we saw. That was an artifact creature that cost 1 mana, so you can put in potentially a 2/1 or things like that. Sorry. And so the amount of cheap artifacts in the set are going to matter, and the ability to ninjutsu this card is going to matter as well. Like, for example, curving the 1 mana 2/1 artifact creature in white into this would make you attack with that. You play it on turn 1, on turn 2 you attack, you ninjutsu this in, and then you return the artifact creature to your hand, and then you immediately get to put it back into play. And so you're getting a huge tempo advantage. So the ceiling of the card is really high, the floor is relatively low. And then finally, Quadrant Theory. Again, it's very good if you're ahead. If you can ninjutsu it, that's pretty great. It's when you're behind, it's like a not great, it's like a mediocre blocker. At parity, doesn't really do a ton because you're not attacking with unblocked creatures. It's fine. And then if you are in the developing stages of the game, it can be pretty devastating. So those are the sorts of things to keep in mind with this sort of card. It's like a mediocre card if you are behind or in parity, but it's very good if you're putting on the pressure or developing with a fast start. Next up, we're looking at context. How does the card line up with the format? Is being an artifact creature really relevant? Is a 2/4 a really good stat line? These are the sorts of questions to answer. Next, is there synergy in the color? Are there a lot of artifacts that you want to put into play? Are there a lot of evasive creatures that you can use to get Covert Technician to ninjutsu in? Is there a lot of ninja synergies within blue itself? Are there synergies outside the color? We already saw that it plays well with that particular one drop in white. It also plays well with the reconfigure one drop we saw in red. As that's another creature that you can use to trigger the Covert Technician early. So potentially has a lot of synergy outside of the color. And even pairing it with black, it pairs well with ninja synergies potentially, because black-blue is the color of the ninja deck in this format. So it looks like it might potentially pair well with all three other color combinations, and so that synergy could boost up the power level of the card significantly. And then finally, is it an archetype key? Is this the sort of card where you really build your deck to maximize it, or is it just kind of a role player in the deck? This looks like more of a role player because it doesn't do anything like game-breakingly powerful, but it could be the sort of card that you really want to build your deck to maximize in some cases. Being an uncommon means you're less likely to get multiples, so you can't build your deck around it as much, but it could potentially be very good when the right deck. Next up, for our final example of cookie cutter and context, we're going to look at Leech Gauntlet. And again, it's a very unique effect, 1 in a black for a 2/2 lifelink artifact creature, and then it can also reconfigure for 4 to give equipped creature lifelink. So pretty unique effect. There have been some 2/1s with lifelink in black in the past, like Child of Night, or 2/2s that have lifelink on your turn, things like Leech Fanatic in black. But there's not really any cards that have this sort of effect on the game. And so it doesn't really seem apt to do a comparison method because this one's clearly a lot more powerful than those ones in the past. So let's look at it. The vanilla test, 2 mana 2/2 lifelink artifact creature seems pretty good to me. I mean, that's just on its baseline already a solid card. So you can kind of just check that box. Yes, solid card. Floor and ceiling. The floor, 2 mana 2/2 lifelink artifact. Pretty good. Like the floor is pretty high. The ceiling is you have a late game engine where you give this to your like big 6/5 trampler or something, and all of a sudden you've like stabilized the game past any point of recovery from your opponent because you gave lifelink to a key creature, while also maybe doing some reconfigure shenanigans or like some modified shenanigans. So the ceiling is actually pretty high on this card, and the floor is pretty high, so that makes it a pretty good card overall. Quadrant Theory, pretty good when you're developing because it's a 2-drop. Pretty good when you're ahead because it's a creature. Pretty actually okay at board parity because you can keep giving lifelink to different creatures you have, and that means that you're going to be able to really stabilize well. And then if you're behind, lifelink is one of the better mechanics for catching up, so really good kind of in all 4 stages of Quadrant Theory. Maybe not as good when you're ahead, but that's the least important quadrant because if you're ahead, you can usually find a way to win the game, and it's still a creature in that case. Now let's look at context. How does the card line up with the format? Being an artifact creature has seemed increasingly relevant as we've looked at the cards potentially. And reconfigure to help with modified seems like it could be really important as well. Lifelink, maybe black decks are a little slower. Maybe black decks don't care about lifelink. Maybe black decks will care about lifelink more or less depending on how fast they end up being and how fast the format ends up being. Synergy in color. Are black decks really caring about life gain? Is life gain a theme in the set? It doesn't really look so far, but maybe there is a life gain theme or some life gain synergies at the very least. Maybe black decks really care about having equipments for their modified cards. As we already saw, the black removal spell cared about you having modified cards. Maybe there will be more, so the reconfigure becomes particularly important. And maybe black decks care about artifacts or something of that nature. Synergy outside of the color. Maybe there are other decks that care about life gain. Maybe there are other decks that care about modified or decks that care about artifact. We'll have to see as the format develops, but that's an important question to answer. And is it an archetype key? As an uncommon, it doesn't really seem like the sort of card you're going to like get 5 of and build your deck around or try to do that. But it also seems like it could be really important for your control decks to get a copy of this so that you can stabilize against the more aggressive decks. So we'll have to see how that ends up playing out. But it doesn't really seem like an archetype key rather than just a generically powerful card because it doesn't particularly have like a ton of synergies with a very expensive reconfigure cost, though it does have some synergy. That is going to do it for the cards I evaluate, but I do want to see how you kind of can apply these lessons yourself. So here are 2 practice cards that have been revealed from the set that I want you to comment below with your evaluations of. So Moonsnare Prototype is a blue mana for an artifact. It has tap and tap an untapped artifact or creature you control, add a mana, and then channel for 4 and a blue. Discard Moonsnare Prototype. The owner of target non-land permanent puts it on the top or bottom of their library. And Imperial Subduer, which is 2 and a white for a 3/2. Whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, tap target creature you don't control. So using the 3 C's of comparison cookie cutter and context. I want you to evaluate these cards. Maybe you use a combination of those. Maybe you use only one of them. Maybe you use any number of those that you would like, and make sure you don't have best case scenario mentality as well. And in the comment section down below, evaluate each of those cards, and then I will respond to your comment and let you know what I think of your evaluation of the card, because that's the best way to learn is to practice. And I think these are two really good cards. They're very interesting, very unique designs, but they are common, so they're not too complex for you to practice your evaluation skills. So if you want to practice, leave that in the comment section down below, and I will look them over and let you know what I think of your evaluation, so you can get some practice with your evaluations. That is going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit that thumbs up button if you did enjoy it. Comment with your questions, your evaluations of those cards, and your feedback, and subscribe for more draft content, including plenty of Neon Dynasty content in the coming days. If you did make it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag #BringOnTheNeon, because you're all ready to go for all of the cards that are going to be revealed. You're going to be ready to evaluate them and know how to do so. If you would like to support my content, if you enjoyed this video, if it provided you with some value, and you want to return the favor, you can support my videos and my content on Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. It really does help me continue to make these videos that hopefully provide everyone with a little bit of help getting ready for the cards and the sets, and just getting better at Magic in general. And Patreon is the best way to give back and help me continue to make these videos. So if you're interested, there's a link in the description down below. It's a couple bucks a month. You gain access to some cool rewards, including my card-by-card grade spreadsheet for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So when the full spoiler is revealed, I grade every card in the set, and so you can see how your card evaluations vary from my own. So you can see if the student has surpassed the master, or if you have some extra stuff that maybe you can learn from in my evaluations. So that is linked in the description down below, and I really do appreciate all of my patrons, current and future. You can also find links to the NicolaiBolas Discord server, where you can talk about all these cards with other like-minded Magic players. You can find links to the NicolaiBolas Twitter account, the NicolaiBolas Twitch stream, my articles where I talk about how in my newest one, I talk about how to prepare for a new set, and that's linked in the description down below as well. And just tons of cool links in the description with the NicolaiBolas merch store if you're interested in NicolaiBolas gear and stuff like that. All of that linked in the description down below. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.